So the question now comes, where did we come up with the idea, or where did we get the feeling that this was the proper course of action? Well, keep in mind that for the most part, while we did have a number of different nations got started with the colony business here in North America, France, Holland, Spain, even Sweden, you can go through and really argue that the 13 colonies that would eventually become the United States, they really had an English political heritage and this power of ideas. Now, remember, this is the time of the Enlightenment. This is when you have a lot of really bright people come up with a lot of really good ideas. And one of the individuals that caused a great deal of thought and had a great deal of influence in regards to the founders was this guy right here. Now, this is John Locke. Now, John Locke wrote a number of different treatises. Think of them sort of like his books. But the one that had a huge effect on the framers and the founders was the second treatise of civil government. Now, this had a huge impact on the guys who would eventually be writing the Constitution. Now, keep in mind, I've been using the term both framer and founder. Essentially, think of it this way: you had the founders were those who were involved with the Declaration of Independence and the actual founding of the United States. The framers are the people who were actually part of writing and designing the Constitution. So you'll see that Locke had a great influence on them because quite a few of the founders and framers were one and the same. Well, Locke had a philosophy that was based on a belief in something called natural rights. Now, what natural rights is basically saying is that people existed in a state of nature long before there was any kind of government. Okay, there were the people first, and then eventually they would create governments. But before those governments existed, people were governed by the laws of nature. Okay, so natural law brings about what are referred to as natural rights. Now, basically, you and I have these natural rights for the sole purpose that we are living, breathing individuals. Okay, natural law brings about natural rights. These are things such as life, liberty, and property. Okay, the fact that you and I are human beings means that under natural law, we have the right to live. We have the right to have an existence. Okay, we have not given up the authority over our life to anyone else. Secondly, we have the right to liberty. Liberty essentially means that we are free. We can do what we wish without having to, clear it with anyone above us. And then thirdly, it would be property. We all have our things. Okay, we all have things that we own. You could take, for example, a cell phone. Now, I don't know if you personally own your cell phone or if your parents are more like I was with my son, that we owned the cell phone he was allowed to use, but be that as it may. You think about your cell phone, that is your property. And most people, if someone were to grab your cell phone and take off with it, would chase that person down as quickly as they could to get their property back. So natural law says that we have the right to life, liberty, and property. And what's more, since natural law existed before any kind of government existed, it is superior to the laws that humans have put together, the governments that we have made. Natural law can be used to justify a challenge to the rule of a tyrannical king. The argument being that if you have a king or a government that is trampling upon those rights, then you do have not just the ability, you have not just the permission. In certain respects, you have the obligation to go up against that particular ruler. Now, Locke argued that government has to be built upon the consent of the governed. The people have to agree on who their rulers will be. We are not talking about a point in time where you had the divine right of kings, where you just simply had one person be in charge. But now it has to be with the permission of the people they are ruling. Without the consent of the governed, the government is considered to be illegitimate. Okay? The consent of the governed is a cornerstone of our republic. It's the idea that whoever is ruling us has to have been chosen by the people. Okay, now in the United States, keep in mind, as a republic, the people retain sovereignty. Okay, it's the people who are in charge, and we elect people to operate on our behalf. But those people only have the legitimate ability to do so if they have our consent. Now, it can be very interesting when you look at elections. That doesn't necessarily mean a majority of the people. All it really requires is a plurality. Now, plurality is one of my favorite terms for political science. It simply says one more vote than anybody else, essentially. If you have three people running and there's 100 people voting, 33 vote for candidate A, 33 vote for candidate B, and 34 vote for candidate C, candidate C wins because they got more votes, even though 66% of the people didn't vote for that person. But there's still that consent to be governed. Now, another cornerstone of our republic is the concept of limited government. Now, you can look at this all the way back to the Magna Carta, okay, where you have the king voluntarily giving up some of his power. Now, keep in mind, this was a point in time when the Magna Carta was signed that quite literally, myself as a peasant, I would not have had any rights still. But the nobility would have had a little more right. It no longer meant that the king could simply do whatever the king wanted whenever they wanted to. Now there were some restrictions, and this would keep going through the Glorious Revolution, through aspects of the English Constitution and whatnot, and we would arrive at the point now where the government under which we're going to be living, that we have given our consent to, would have clear restrictions on what the rulers could do. We were not going to be living in a society or a government in which the government could just willy nilly decide whatever they wanted to do that particular day, and we had no recourse. Okay, so Locke argued that there had to be limitations placed on government, and you will find a lot of these strewn throughout the Constitution. We'll talk about those later on. Locke's philosophy also said that the sole purpose of government was to protect our natural rights, our rights to life, liberty, and property. Locke argued that that is the reason governments exist, okay? That we live under whatever the system of government is. We give them the consent to rule over us. But at the same time, their limited role, their limited job is to simply protect our natural rights. There was a senator from Wyoming a few years ago, Senator Alan Simpson. He summed it up with the phrase that what government was supposed to be doing was, as he put it, quote, defend my shores, deliver my mail, and leave me alone, unquote. There are a lot of people who simply wish to be left alone. Now, in an extreme case, as I said before, people do have the right, and you could even argue the obligation to rebel against some kind of tyrannical government. However, this rebellion cannot be over something often referred to as transitory. It can't just be some something that came up that angered you and things like that. No, it has to essentially be some injustices that have become deeply felt when a government, for example, is trampling upon individuals' right to life, their liberties, their property, and things like that. That is the kind of thing where it can be looked upon. Now, again, the concept is that it has to be a serious ongoing problem. It can't just be for whatever reason at whatever time people decide to go through and go after whatever the government is because they were annoyed at something. This knowledge from Mr. Locke, we get to the handiwork of Mr. Jefferson and what could largely be referred to as the American Creed. Now, when Jefferson was given the task of writing the Declaration of Independence, he had studied the works of Locke and agreed with a great number of his ideals. Now, there's a lot of close parallels between Locke's thoughts and Jefferson's language in the Declaration of Independence. Now, please don't think of this in terms of Jefferson was trying to plagiarize Locke. That's not what I mean in any way, shape, or form. No, what we're looking at here were Jefferson wanted to take the ideas that Locke had been talking about, and he wanted to translate those into concrete ways that would work well for the American people. For example, you're going to see that the sanctity of property is one of the only ideas that's really not in Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence. But this concept of property figured prominently in the Constitutional Convention. So you're going to see a great deal in regards to the protection of property of the Constitution, but you're not going to see it enshrined in the same way in the Declaration. Now, Jefferson altered Locke's phrase of life, liberty, and property to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it's almost the exact same thing. The argument has been that essentially it was changed from property to pursuit of happiness to ensure that the slaveholding states would not be able to look back on the Declaration of Independence and cite that as a reason that slavery could never be abolished. There were those founding fathers and those framers who were slave owners, but there were also those who were very much abolitionists. And the idea was to try and set things up that nothing was going to permanently be in stone except life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Everything else could be altered as time would progress. And you'll see as we look at the Constitution, we've made 27 amendments throughout the course of time, and you'll see how the Constitution has changed. And that was one of the things that they set up. They wanted to make sure that people knew from the Declaration it was life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Okay? Now, if you look on paper, there is no way, shape, or form that we should have won against Great Britain. When we had declared our independence and we had gone to war against them, quite literally, yeah, we should have lost. However, there is a quote from years later from Winston Churchill that talked about the fact that the destiny of nations cannot be measured by material computation. Up actually winning our independence, as odd as that seemed. Now, the thing is, the Declaration of Independence was merely an announcement of the beginning. When we wrote the Declaration of Independence, when we voted on that, this was just the start. Okay? We had to fight our way through. Now, we were outnumbered, we were outgunned. For example, I've read what we had were referred to as Brown Bess muskets. Now, these were not the world's greatest muskets. I have read that they were accurate something like 1 out of every 300 shots. So you could have 300 people aiming at the same target and maybe one would hit it. But we were able to hold our own. We were able to get some allies. France would help us out and things like that. And eventually we would win our independence. But this was what could be referred to as a conservative revolution. Now, I want you to think back to world history and think back to what was going on in regards to the French Revolution. Now, when that happened, if you recall, they go through, they overthrow the king, they execute the nobility, and then the revolutionaries are in what's referred to as the circular firing squad. They start killing one another, and it just devolves into chaos. Ours was not like that. Ours was not a revolution to try and overthrow the king. We were not going to England with the intent of beheading King George. This was essentially a conservative movement that didn't really change our colony's way of life. The people who were living here, the colonists themselves, all they wanted was a restoration of the rights they felt were already theirs as British subjects. So you think about the French Revolution a few years after ours. That's going to be one in which an individual's life was radically changed. Ours, it wasn't. It wasn't the attempt to go through and radically overthrow the government, make everything different. All we were trying to do was essentially restore the rights that we felt already belonged to us. We weren't trying to make a huge change in the world. All we wanted was the protection of the rights we knew in our hearts were already ours.